My work is basically video advocacy. And by video advocacy, we try to amplify the voices of the voiceless. And in this case, when I say the voice of the voiceless, I mean refugees and internally displaced persons. And when we are to categorize that, that is like forced migrants. And so collectively, my work is more of using video to amplify those voices of forced migrants. I think in terms of methods that have been helpful in my work, I look at the issue of facilitated film screening as a very important tool for us. Because with facilitated film screening, you're able to take stories of the community. But how do you use it? The best way to use it is to go back to the very communities and engage them using it. Because from then, they can then identify with the issues that are actually appearing in the videos. So through facilitated film screening, a lot of issues come out because you tend to discuss the core of the content that you'd otherwise not have brought out if you just went with a paper to discuss something. So video advocacy is so powerful in bringing out issues that are otherwise hidden within the communities. I like to say that video advocacy is more of a tool. And as a tool, it's part of a research methodology. And so what is so powerful in terms of the methodology that we use, I think consent is quite important, because without consent, your work can be rendered useless. I have experience of that where someone says, I've accepted to be interviewed, but after a year or 2 or 3, he changes his or her mind. Now, if you do not have that consent, it becomes problematic. Normally, the group that we work with are more of vulnerable communities. They include forced migrants, which is refugees and IDPs. And so sometimes when you engage such communities, they expect so much. So dealing with that expectations, when you don't meet that, they later come behind after a year or 2, and because they think that is the best way to try and approach to get something out of it. And so they will try to withdraw their consent. And in terms of how we respond, of course, you have to adhere to what their demands are. You have to withdraw if you have produced a documentary, you just have to get rid of it. But unfortunately, for those that we've already put online, the best we can do is just to put it offline. Otherwise, it's so hard to deal with it when it reaches a final product. Time is a very important aspect when it comes to funding. When you get funding which requires a period of 5 years, sometimes your documentary can go beyond 5 years. And so if a donor requires that, you do that within that period. And you're able to project and see that you can't do within that period. It becomes very problematic. And so you choose either to take the project, or you just let it go and look for another funder. So that on its own, it's quite challenging, because the issues and the stories that we deal with in terms of video advocacy are more of rehabilitation of victims. And so if you put a time frame on when to rehabilitate the victim, it will become so unrealistic and inhuman. And so the work that we do using video advocacy, you cannot put a time frame to it, especially if you're documenting victims or survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And in terms of audiences, it's true audiences, different audiences they have different demands. And so, for example, if you go to a community which has an audience that is is getting out of a conflict, that kind of audience would always require immediate result. And so sometimes it still comes to expectations. How do you deal with it? Because the longer you take, the more mistrust you create with that community. And so there's a way you have to be factual on dates and time. When do you hope to go back to that community? So it's important that you emphasize on the exact date on when you think the project will end, or else you have constant phone calls, and if you stop responding to their needs and you don't communicate, you lose the trust. And when you lose the trust, you'll always need that community. And so you do not want to get to that kind of situation. And so that's how it actually determines what kind of audience you need.